is Islamic finance just mimicking conventional finance?
At some level, I think that's true. They want to use conventional products and structures that they're very familiar with and get the sharia tick. Ultimately, Islamic finance and muamalat and what makes something halal and haram is going to be a question of legal structures. People talk about Islamic mortgages and they say that, this is very similar to a conventional mortgage. But no, in reality, entire thing is different.
Assalamu alaikum guys, hope you're well. Don't worry about Ibrahim, he's safe, he's not locked in my dungeon. I'm Sohaib, I'm a portfolio manager for IFG, and I've also been a classmate of Ibrahim for the past 2 years whilst we've been studying Islamic finance. Today, I'm going to put Ibrahim in the hot seat and ask him all the criticisms to do with Islamic finance. We're going to be talking about some of the key criticisms when it comes to Islamic finance, such as, is it a scam? Is it invented by non-Muslims? Or are we actually getting ripped off here? Let's dive in. Ibrahim, how are you feeling?
It's a pleasure to be here. I've never been invited onto this channel before.
It's fine. I'm always about giving people their big break in the YouTube world. But let's dive into things. I think just straight off the bat, is Islamic finance just mimicking conventional finance?
At some level, I think that's true, because where Islamic finance started was back in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, where you had some of the early practitioners of Islamic finance who were looking at the modern conventional financial system and thinking, wow, there's these very impressive products, and is there a way that we can get access to that in an halal way? And there was this other thread, by the way, that was very interesting, the Professor Khurshid Ahmed's and the thread of researchers and academics that were thinking about Islamic finance much more from first principles. And it was actually less about Islamic finance, it was more about the Islamic economy as a whole. But what ended up happening, I think, was a strand of Islamic finance didn't really ever become the main thing. And actually it was the guys who were looking to come up with products that became what most of Islamic finance became. I think Islamic finance has, unfortunately, historically, had this issue of we need to mimic or we need to create an Islamic or synthetic version of what already exists as a conventional product. I think that is changing though. I think over the last few years, there are fintechs and new product manufacturers and companies that are coming along that are now bringing products to market that are thought from first principles, that are looking to actually solve the problem and give a solution that is for the problem exactly. And not trying to, imagine, because ultimately, look, when you create a product, you're trying to create a product that matches, a problem. And Muslims have different problems to non-Muslims in many cases. And so if you're trying to create a solution that doesn't quite fit onto the problem, that's not really going to work. Today, I think we've got examples that are hopefully much more promising. And I think a number of the new fintechs that are coming along, there's a number in the UK, people like ourselves, I think Wahid, Nesta, there's people like Fida, Offer. There's a number of fintechs that are now trying to solve precise problems that are very community oriented, and I think that's really promising.
So jumping right in, Ibrahim, I think one of the biggest criticism, if not the biggest criticism when it comes to Islamic finance, I think many critique that conventional finance is just like a small tweak when it comes to like the legal structure, and there's this whole thing of form over substance where contracts are restructured just enough to pass as Islamics, but essentially on the outside they still kind of function the same as conventional products. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's I think there's some truth to it. Broadly speaking, I would caution against going down this line of attack though. There's some truth to it, is that there are people who have the intention in the Islamic finance industry, they're primarily from a commercial intent. And so they want to use conventional products and structures that they're very familiar with and get the sharia tick, and then look to try and promote that to a different target audience. And I think that from a intent perspective is not necessarily the best intent. But the reason why I would caution against this is because ultimately Islamic finance and muamalat and what makes something halal and haram is going to be a question of legal structures. It is going to be a question of contract. And for someone who is not well versed in this subject, it's so easy and glib to say, oh, look, you guys are just, you've made a few tweaks to the contract and therefore you're trying to say that this is halal, you're going to charge more, and that's what you're up to. But I don't think that's always fair, because in the contract itself, if you change some of the the risks and the rewards and the obligations, sure, it might not necessarily immediately reflect on the price that you're paying, but actually the entire risk profile and who's actually on the hook for what changes. I'll give you an example of this. Like, people talk about Islamic mortgages and they say that this is very similar to a conventional mortgage, but no, in reality the entire thing is different. An Islamic bank in an Islamic mortgage actually owns the property, and I'm actually going through a transaction at the moment, and it's very different to a conventional mortgage transaction. Lawyers are not used to it. They're like, oh, why does a bank need to approve of this? Why is the bank the owner? The entire dynamic is different. Yep. And when you're the owner, it comes with a different risk and a different reward aspect to it as well. A lot of the time it doesn't show up, but when things go wrong or at key junctures, it does show up. And that's where there is a clear difference between Islamic finance and conventional finance. This is not a question that is new. This is a question that the Quraysh and the people around the Rasulullah's time were asking as well. And the Quran answers them. They say, قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَى. They say that bay' transactions is like riba, is like interest. وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He answers them very clearly. He says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made permissible transactions, buying and selling, and He has made impermissible riba. It's as simple as that. Sure, there might be similarities. Of course, there is always similarities, but that doesn't change the fundamental difference in the entire transaction and the risk and the rewards.
Where do you think Islamic banks kind of fit into this puzzle? Because I think what we've seen in the past decade or so, that it's not really been these Islamic banks who've been around for 3-4 decades that are innovating and making change. And I think a lot of people look to these kind of big infrastructures and big systems to be making the change, but unfortunately they're kind of just stuck in their ways. It's only been these new startup fintech type peoples that have started to innovate and make new structures and bring them to market. How do you think us as an everyday Muslim should be interacting with Islamic banks if that's the case?
Look, ultimately businesses that succeed are solving real problems of real people, and they intimately understand the problem and they often feel that problem themselves. And so organically you have businesses that emerge, because business is just another way of saying a collection of people who've come together to solve a particular problem. Now, if we look at the history of Islamic banking, what we find, let's just focus on the UK for a start. What we find is that these Islamic banks have often, the start of it has been that it's a nice trophy project for people from the Middle East, large corporates from the Middle East, to have a base in the UK for them to be able to facilitate their own transactions and also transactions of their compatriots from whatever Gulf country it might be. And almost as an afterthought, there are some additional products and a few additional services that are offered to the indigenous Muslim community here in the UK. And when that happens, you see that there is a fundamental disconnect between who you're serving and the problem that you're solving. Because really the problem that they started with solving is what I just stated, and they solved that. They solved that very effectively. But this additional stuff came along almost as an afterthought. And so, I think that's where we've had a bit of a, the losing of our way sometimes when it comes to Islamic finance. And I think in the Middle East, where you see some of the larger Islamic banks, I don't know that story as well as I know the UK story. But again, I actually think in the Middle East, it has been a little bit more about let's work with existing structures as much as possible, because that's where the talent is. Conventional finance, conventional banking, there's people from that pool that we can draw from, and let's try and make sure that it's also sharia compliant. And so what's then ended up happening is that a lot of the Islamic banks, they rightly or wrongly, often rightly by the way, follow existing conventional banking structures. But where we need that little bit of extra additional innovation and thinking about, okay, well, what is the Islamic aspect of Islamic finance? There, we're relying on just the Shari'i scholars. And the problem when you do that is the Shari'i scholars, they're not there for product innovation, really, because they're not financiers. They're people who are saying this is halal or this is haram, and they will happily do that, and they'll try and facilitate as much as possible. But where we've had that gap is that people who are practitioners are not sufficiently well versed in Islamic law and have the intent and the ambition of getting to a particular endpoint with Islamic finance. And that's where you end up getting to a point of stasis, where what was seen as an interim solution, then people just coagulate around that as the final endpoint. And when that happens, you start seeing these kind of rumblings of, it just doesn't seem as satisfactory as it could have been. Having said all of that, I guess the hope here is that things are changing. The Muslim community is growing. There's increasing prosperity here. A lot of these fintechs have come along, and there's a lot of interest by some of these incumbents on these fintechs. Just like there was, with Revolut and Monzo in the conventional space, and people looking at them and getting inspired by them. I'm hopeful that some of these large, more cumbersome, let's say Islamic bank or Islamic financial players, they can take inspiration from the innovation that's been happening, and that starts percolating through, and we actually see productivity and something that's a lot more in sync with the community's problems coming to the fore across the entire ecosystem.
Makes sense. I hear what you're saying in terms of, there is a lot of change happening and this is the way you can afford. But like for me as like an everyday kind of consumer, where there's still some wrinkle around the edges, I'm not 100% comfortable with, how Islamic finance products look like as they are today. And on top of that, they're a lot more expensive than other products that you see in the conventional kind of ecosystem. How should I be like looking at this as like a everyday Muslim?
It's a good question. So what is challenging sometimes, I find, in the Islamic finance space is that you have spectrums of sharia compliance, and within the marketing of certain companies who might be on certain aspects of that spectrum, the easy thing to do is to say everyone else is not permissible, everyone else is somehow deficient and therefore haram, possibly. And when that happens a lot in the ecosystem, then the entire industry as a whole suffers. And the reality is, this aspect of mu'amalat, just like any other aspect of fiqh, you have a broad range of opinions. It is not for me to say that my teacher, Sheikh Akram Nadwi, is wrong when he says that you're allowed to take a conventional mortgage because out of necessity, because that's something that you need to be able to buy a house. And people like Sheikh Sohaib Hassan and a number of other scholars would have sympathies for that view. Sheikh Yusuf Qardawi, one of the the great ulama of the last 100 years, they all have this view. Now, of course, my personal view is different. I feel like times have changed. Islamic mortgages have come along. I've looked very deeply into the Islamic mortgage contracts, and I've come up with a different view. But what ends up happening, unfortunately, is that people do go and say, actually, you know what? He's wrong, he's wrong, he's wrong, he's wrong. This is my viewpoint. And, this is a point of fiqh. This is a point of some scholars' different ijtihad. And when you throw the baby out with the bathwater, what you actually end up with is a complete loss of trust in the entire industry and in the entire ecosystem. So I would be very cautious about that. And I actually would say, for the average layman, it's really not complicated, guys, right? Do you get confused about doing salah because someone's doing Rafa' Yadayn, someone's doing it in the Maliki way, someone might be even a Shia, right? And they've busted out some rock there, and you're like, oh, this is too confusing. Prayer is like messed up. It's all haram. Therefore, I'm not going to pray, or therefore I'm going to start worshipping statues. Of course, you're not going to do that. It's the same with Islamic finance. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask those of knowledge if you don't know. Find someone that you trust, their credentials, and you believe in them, and you can ask them perhaps questions. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do istikhara, and then make a decision and then stick by it. And I think that's the way to get through a lot of this noise, because you're not going to be an expert in absolutely everything. We do need to look at authority figures in terms of what needs to be done. On the point around whether or not Islamic finance is more expensive, in some situations, I do believe that Islamic financial products, they do sometimes take the mick. But actually, in the vast majority of cases, I think that Islamic financial products, they are priced at a higher price point simply because they're a niche product. Let's take the example of ETFs. Halal ETF. I don't know what the Halal ETF is like. Let's have a look at it right now. Halal ETF fees. Let's have a look. So this is the Wahid ETF. The management fees are 0.5%. And if you go into it via the wrapper, I think it's about 0.5% on top of that. Now you compare that to, the like any of the Vanguard, the S&P 500 ETF, there is, you're looking at 0.08%. And you're like, oh my God, I'm getting ripped off. 0.5% versus 0.08%. What's going on here? But actually, the Wahid ETF, I don't actually know what its AUM is, but it might be in the several hundreds of millions. And the Vanguard ETF is around 1 trillion. So they're making literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds, if not billions, just from fees on that, even though it's a much lower fee rate. Whereas Wahid, to my best of my knowledge, I don't think he's even break even yet, right? Or just about break even in some countries. And so to say that we are going to compare apples and oranges in this way, and you need to be more competitive in an industry that rewards economies of scale, I think is unfair. And I think the other place where people misstep, they just don't know what they're talking about, frankly, right? Where, sometimes we hear feedback, why are you guys charging 2% on your private funds, whereas Vanguard is charging 0.08%, or some of the publicly listed funds are charging 0.5 or 1%. Well, because it's a completely different product, because it's a private markets product, and 2% is standard in this entire industry, and that's reflective of a lot of the additional work that goes into it as well. I would say that there are maybe quibbles at the edges of people who perhaps are charging a bit more than they perhaps should, but actually the majority of the people that I have seen in the industry are, largely speaking, actually within market range. And actually the real reason why it's a bit more expensive, particularly in the West, is because it's a subset. We're a small subset of the overall population. And if you go to the Middle East, where the Muslims are the majority and sharia-compliant investments and finance is the mainstream, it's very competitive with the broader market. So I don't think there's something inherent in Islamic finance that makes it more expensive. It's just supply and demand.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in Dubai right now, and if you look at Islamic products versus conventional products, it's basically the same. You just choose one or the other. I think you made an interesting point regarding the marketing and the branding around Islamic finance. You mentioned that the USP shouldn't be around the Sharia compliance, just because it drags us down as an industry. But there's this ongoing conversation in the Islamic finance or the Islamic community in terms of Islamic finance products shouldn't be branded as Islamic finance. It should just be finance products that are ethical and in line with Sharia values. As someone who runs a Islamic finance company that's overtly Islamic finance as well, it's got the Muslims on the front of it, our channel and everything is overtly Muslim. What's your kind of views on that?
Rasulullah, he came as a rahmatul lil alameen. He came for all of mankind. I think that there's ultimately a really powerful role that Islamic finance, or ethical finance, if you want to call it that, can play in bringing people towards a better way of life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would want us to live. It doesn't matter about what you call it. And I think that if that is the core message, core mission and message of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the core commandment of Islam, of the Quran, ud'u ila sabili rabbik bil hikmah wal maw'izatil hasana, call to the way of your Lord. And each of the prophets, they came and they called to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the core command. Then absolutely, this thing that we call Islamic finance or investment needs to be for everyone. Now you might say, hang on a second, Ibrahim, that's cool, but what about the fact that it's called IFG? Ultimately, my vision is that you actually do need products that are labeled for Muslims so that they can easily find them as well. And it speaks to that consumer. And that's just, marketing 101. But then we also have Curate Capital. And Curate Capital isn't called Islamic Finance Guru, it's called Curate Capital. And ultimately where I would like to get to with IFG and Curate is we get to a point of critical mass where we have now, stabilized or helping the Muslim community properly. And that's when we expand out and go to the mainstream as well. But you can't do both at the same time, because otherwise you're just boiling the ocean and you're not really going to be able to achieve either goal.
When it comes to Islamic banks, one of the biggest criticisms is the use of something called Commodity Murabaha, which is effectively a debt structure that mimics conventional finance or conventional products, and is something that's used by 90%, 95% of the Islamic finance kind of industry. I think if you look at Islamic banks, it's the most popular structure that's in use, and it doesn't seem like it's going away anytime soon. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what Commodity Murabaha is and what the problem is, and what do you see as a solution to move away from it?
This is a topic that it's a hot topic. Lots of people have strong views and thoughts on it. In a nutshell, my view is that Commodity Murabaha should be avoided as far as humanly possible, but it does have a place in the toolkit of the Islamic financial institution and the Shari'i scholar and the practitioner as well, and can be used from time to time in rare circumstances. The reason why I actually think this entire halubaloo is missing the woods for the trees is that Islamic finance is this tiny segment of the entire financial institution, financial world. And Islamic finance is about ethics and morality and trying to, bring a fairer way of doing, mu'amalat and fairer way of doing investments, and hopefully, rising our ummah as well, in terms of prosperity. If we think about the real big issues in the world today, it's things like dealing with poverty. It's things like our monetary system as a whole is incredibly unfair. And that's actually the real thing that we should be looking to try and tackle. It's looking to, take the modes of investment and taking those modes of investment where circulating back into our own economies, our own industries, our own areas. Unfortunately, a lot of our investments these days go from Sohaib's pocket to Tesla, Elon Musk's pocket. Who is that actually benefiting? 99% of our investments are going over to certain companies in the S&P 500. And that's perfectly fine for a portion of your portfolio. But if all of the countries in the world are doing that, then what ends up happening is that you end up with hollow husks that are effectively just outsourcing everything to the US. And this is actually a problem not just for Muslims, but for this country as a whole. And this is why there's this entire debate around policy, around whether pension funds should be investing in this country or overseas, etc., etc. Coming back to this point around Commodity Murabaha, it's just like so way down the list of issues that the average person should be bothered with when it comes to mu'amalat and Islamic finance and investments and where the ummah is and how to make your money halal. It should be something that only technicians and scholars and operators and academics think and talk about. And I will address it in a second because I'm one of those people, right? We're in the field. But from a perspective of, creating this entire discussion and narrative around, oh my God, if someone does Commodity Murabaha, you are massively, misstepping, and this is why our ummah is failing, and this is why we've got problems in this entire industry. I think it's missing the wood for the trees. The real problem the industry has is that it doesn't know where it's going. The real problem is that the vast majority of people are either in there to just tick a box and just do what everyone else does and just be working in finance and make some money, or because they want to throw stones at other people whilst they live in glass houses. No one is articulating, or very few people are articulating, where as an industry we need to be going. And where as an industry we need to be going is pretty clear. And that is looking back at the Quran and the Sunnah. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala demand from us in terms of creating an economy, an ecosystem, and an environment that is much more just, that is free of riba? What does that actually precisely look like? And then what are the steps for us to get there? So I've done a white paper on this as a very early level sketch, and many other people will need to feed into this and, take this forward. But that's the discussion that we need to be having. On the topic of Commodity Murabaha itself, so we, as you know, we typically avoid using it, and we will avoid it and negotiate hard and structure things to avoid it as much as possible. But in certain transactions, we will use it because it's not something is haram in any way, shape, or form, and there is an entire corpus of fiqh around making things easy for people. Like if you actually look at the books of fiqh, Imam Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani, one of the three big imams of the Hanafi madhab, he actually wrote a book called Kitab al-Hiyal, which I had the honor of studying with Sheikh Sohail Hanif.
Hiyal's financial engineering, financial structuring. Financial
engineering or financial structuring, or finding a way to solve a problem that someone might have in a way that is halal. And the role of the scholar is to try and make it easy for people. And there is an entire corpus of this tradition. And even in the Quran, you see it, right? Where Ibrahim a.s. said, inni saqim, or kabiruhum hadha fas'aluhu in kanu, like he's the statue, ask him if he can speak. He says that Ibrahim alayhi salam, he said a number of things during his lifetime which technically are like white lies, but they're not actually really lies at all. And even in Ayyub alayhi salam, when he took this oath that he was going to hit his wife with 100 lashes, and then the guidance came that actually you should use blades of grass to do it instead. And these are all hiyal, right? And this is a part of our tradition, and it's a very technical part of the tradition. Like, this is the part of the tradition where you need to study it in like kind of the PhD section, right? You don't bring that information to the GCSE level because otherwise it's going to confuse everyone. But that's unfortunately what's happening right now in our industry. We're taking this technical discussion of commodity murabaha, which has its place, and it might be abused in some cases, by the way, right? And I'm not disagreeing with that. And if I was in charge of Islamic banks in the Middle East in particular, I'd be looking to try and structure things very differently there. But taking that conversation and then throwing shade on the entire industry, I think is deeply, deeply damaging. It can really affect the trust in the entire industry as a whole.
But I think the problem is that everyone can get behind this message of we should be going back to the Quran and Sunnah, we should be getting back to first principles. But the problem with commodity murabaha is kind of like this get out of jail free card where everyone just seems to use it for everything. And so I do agree that this is how we should be thinking, but the fact that commodity murabaha exists, it's just kind of a bit of a cop-out in terms of, no one's really thinking about doing other things. No one's really thinking about doing innovative structures. And that's kind of what's left us in this rut where Islamic finance just hasn't been innovating over the past couple of decades.
I agree with that. I completely agree with that. And this is why we try hard. Like, we've spent 3 or 4 months structuring a, musharaka, ijara, product in the USA to do property finance, because we could have done it easily overnight just doing commodity murabaha. We didn't do that. We spent our time to structure and work it out and make things work because we knew that we didn't need to use commodity murabaha there. Like, in some places, because of tax issues, you kind of are forced to do it, right? Because there isn't really any other way to do it. But in certain places you can. So I completely hear that that concern, and I think there should be a push on certainly the Islamic banks in the Middle East to try and move away from these products as much as possible. But at the same time, what I would say is that the real issue that if you're like, this is what I'm saying, right? Like, it's like 3rd or 4th or 5th on the list of priorities. If you're really like sincere about wanting the Islamic industry or the Islamic finance industry to be truly Islamic, or the Islamic economy to be truly Islamic, the thing that you really need to go for is the monetary system and how and why and where investments work, and moving our money from rent-seeking behavior into growth investments so that it's actually growing our economy. That's actually the really important questions that we should be tussling with. And this is, sometimes I struggle with trying to articulate this, because it's really easy to say something is bad. It's really easy to actually critique something. But when you're trying to create a positive argument, you're having to say that, look, this thing is imperfect, which necessarily everything pretty much is. And you're saying that you need to move it in a certain direction. And it's a much more nuanced and complicated proposal that you're putting forward. But I think as Muslims, we have to be putting forward positive proposals rather than tearing down things constantly.
Let's just double clicking on rent-seeking behavior. Like, what does that look like? What are you trying to say about the Muslim community? And then, what do you think should be the solution in terms of putting money into productive assets?
If we look under the hood in the Islamic finance assets under management, the vast majority of them are in bonds or fixed income or sukuk type products. And that's disproportionate to how it is in the conventional investment management industry. In the conventional investment management industry, a lot more of their assets under management are actually allocated towards growth, i.e. investing in real businesses solving real problems. Whereas, unfortunately, in the Islamic finance industry, we have leaned a lot more towards credit and debt and rent-seeking behaviors. And what ultimately that plays out in the real world, over 20, 30, 40 years, you are not investing enough in businesses, in people who are solving problems. And therefore, Sam Altman is not a Muslim. And therefore, Jeff Bezos is not a Muslim. And therefore, Mark Zuckerberg is not a Muslim, and there are many people who are much less well known than these guys. But the American economy invests in growth, and that is both a culture shift, but it's also a shift of where you're pumping that money in. And as a Islamic finance industry, unfortunately, it's really easy for Islamic banks to just engage in this kind of arbitrage, rent-seeking behavior. And as soon as the regulators in these ecosystems, they start shifting in terms of how the monetary system works, or how much reserves you need to keep, and what needs to be happening with this money. As soon as innovative things take place at that level, suddenly those money flows start changing. The money flows don't just go into the really rent-seeking stuff, they actually start going into a more at-risk capital. And once that starts happening, you start seeing the entire economy grow. And that takes 20, 30 years, but then you see real fruits. And I actually think this is like going to have 50 or 100 times more impact when we as a community talk about that and focus on that than if we talk about technicalities of various different products. Like, I mean, that's sure, cool, do that. Talk about, the porcine gelatin in a particular paracetamol or something, but don't miss the fact that we have diabetes and obesity in our community. Like, why are we talking about that when we could just deal with obesity when it comes to health and Muslims?
Just on that same point as well, I think some people often say like one of the biggest issues when it comes to Islamic finance and Muslims and money is the fact that we're living in this ecosystem of banking, Islamic banking, and fractional reserve banking, and a lot of people are saying that in order for us to progress, we need to kind of escape this kind of ecosystem. And I've seen online there's a lot of talk of things like Bitcoin or going into cryptocurrency, and we should be moving away from the fractional reserve banking system. What's your thoughts in terms of that? And do you have any thoughts around Bitcoin and all these other alternative kind of ecosystem?
I'm not a specialist in crypto. Other than both you and I invest in all cat-related
meme coins.
Yeah, I think this is the question, right? This is the topic. And I know that people like Haris Irfan talk about this a lot, and I bang on about it a lot as well. And I think this is the most important topic. We're talking about, we've seen how even global, sanctions frameworks work, and how payment and like people like Launch Good have recently, had a number of issues when it comes to their payments and money flows, just because unfortunately they're Muslim, right? That seems to be pretty much the only issue that they've had, and a number of charities, have faced similar issues as well. And so this is the important conversation that we need to be having in terms of like, what is the nature of money, and how does that link to the nature of control and power, and who has the the ability to turn off the tap and turn on the tap, and green light some people and red light some people. That is the big question that we need to be addressing. And my view is that, I don't have a solution to it, but my initial thoughts are that, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, crypto technology is definitely an area where there could be some solutions, and also potentially some kind of gold-based hawala system. Maybe there's some value there as well. I need to do more thinking around that.
You've talked about, how expensive Islamic finance is, and a big problem to do with this is the economies of scales that come with it. How does Islamic finance go in the next 5 to 10 years to being something that's a niche product and very expensive to being on the forefront and potentially competing with all these other conventional banks?
It's really interesting that over the last year, we've seen one of the top 10 global banks approach us because they want to offer an Islamic financial product. Investment product. We've seen one of the top 3 asset managers, actually the biggest pension fund in the UK, wanting to do sharia products, wanting to get some advice on that. And there are a number of others coming into this space as well. And the reason is that we are at the cusp of the Muslim community going from, just in the UK, 6.5-7% of the population, according to estimates, up to 15 to 18% of the population by 2050. Because the Muslim community is relatively young, it's actually becoming an increasingly more middle class community as well. And this is just set to grow, right? And if you look across the global landscape, you see slightly older populations in Western Europe, in places like China and Japan, whereas you see much younger populations in places like the Middle East, India, in the BRIC countries. What that is actually telling us is that the secular macro trends, this is stuff that you can't really resist. This is just a tidal wave that is actually in favor of the Muslim community and the Muslim demographics. And we've seen that in our own business, right? Where a few years ago, perhaps there was a few 100,000 coming in per month. These is several millions of pounds being invested per month. And I can only see that, growing, God willing. I think it's less a question of, how it's going to happen. It's a question of, what is our conduct in the process of this inevitable thing happening? Like, are we going to give the keys over to these larger corporates to, give an Islamic wrapper to a product and then offer that to the Muslim community? Or are we going to actually step up as a community itself and say that, this is, these are our problems, and we want to be actively participating in the product manufacture and the solutions to the problems that our community faces ourselves, so that it's a lot more, authentic in many ways. Ultimately, what I'm saying is that I think there's a lot of hope for us as an industry. So the people who are saying that we don't like these prices being so high, I think that's going to change, because there's going to be a lot more entrants, and there already are a lot more entrants in this market, and that's going to, because of demand and supply, we're going to see a lot more competition, and we're going to see a proliferation of products, better products for cheaper. And that can only be good, inshallah, for the community.
Inshallah. So we just covered off some of the hottest topics in Islamic finance. Let us know in the comments if you're happy with Ibrahim's answers, or if we need to get him back so I can roast him again in the hot seat. I'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.